Hello, listeners. This is Dr. Dieter Veldsman, and you are listening to the CHRO Mindset Podcast.
Hello, listeners. Welcome back to season 2 of the CHRO Mindset podcast. After an incredible first season, we are back with more dynamic conversations and actionable insights. On today's episode, we'll be diving into how 2025 is shaping up from an HR perspective. To discuss more, we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Dieter Veldsman onto today's episode of the CHRO Mindset podcast. So let's dive in. Dr. Dieter, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Pulkit. Lovely to be with you, and welcome to all the listeners.
Great, great. So before I go any further, I'd love to give our audience a quick rundown of your profile, your biography. Dr. Dieter Veldsman is a distinguished organizational psychologist with over 15 years of expertise in strategic HR, organizational design, and development. Currently serving as the chief HR scientist at the Academy to Innovate HR, which is AIHR. He has contributed to transformative projects across EMEA, APAC, and LATAM. An accomplished academic contributor and professor of practice at the University of Johannesburg. He has authored peer-reviewed articles and is set to release 2 books in 2025. Recognized as the CHRO of the Year 2021 and the Practitioner of the Year 2018, his mission is to educate and inspire 1 lakh HR professionals by 2025. Dr. Dieter, thank you so much for joining us today and welcome again to the CHRO Mindset podcast.
Thank you very much, Pulkit. Lovely to be, and I look forward to our conversation.
Awesome. So let's dive in with our very first question. If you had to describe the future of HR in 1 word, what would it be?
I'm going to cheat on your very first question, Pulkit. I'm going to give you 3 words that I think describes the future. The first one is human. I think the second one is opportunity. And the third one is transcend. And to put that into context, it's for me about the opportunities on the horizon for us to really lead the next chapter of work as HR professionals.
Great, great. Thank you for those 3 words. We were off to a great start. Let's get going. Entire theme that we have picked up for this podcast is going to revolve around a recent report, right, on AI that AIHR has published. And I'm sure it's going to be an awesome conversation. So let's talk about AI in HR, right? Why do you think there's a gap between AI's potential in HR and its actual adoption by HR teams? Because on paper everything looks very good, but when it comes to execution side of it, how do we overcome that leakage? What should the HRs do to be able to really put their plans into tangible outcomes?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things to consider there, Pulkit. And I think the first one is really around the fact that with AI, and especially with generative AI, we are in that typical hype cycle where I think a lot of people are only now finding their feet around, but what do I actually use the technologies for? We find high levels of adoption at the individual level. So to make that practical, HR professionals using it for content writing, helping write emails, helping analyze large amounts of data and information. But where the hesitancy has really been is to take that to that next step around applying AI at the team or at the practice or at the process level. And we find almost 60% of HR professionals in our research tells us around the fact that they are struggling to make that leap into that next level of AI adoption. And very often that's where we believe a lot of the impact of AI in future will lie. But the reasons why people are not making that leap is also understandable. And I think the first one they mention is, education. They don't know how to do it. A lot of organizations are still thinking about, but what are the guardrails, the ethics, the data that we do need to think about in terms of responsible AI use, as well as then also the experimentation component. So we find the more people are exposed to AI, the more they start seeing its value and its application. And in some organizations, they're not necessarily putting that in place in a safe environment for people to start experimenting. And, ourselves as HR professionals, we are a little bit more risk averse because we know what the consequences are of when things go wrong. So I think there is that component around mindset that we are going to have to manage for HR professionals, as well as then the skill set and then the confidence to apply some of these newer tools.
Great thoughts there. While you have, discussed to a certain degree the barriers here, but if we can, take a deep dive again into that. I mean, from your vantage point, what are the biggest barriers to integrating AI into HR workflows? That is the first part of the question. And second is, how should organizations overcome them?
Yeah, I think it's a two-parter, right? So I think on the one side, what we are starting to see is, and as I've mentioned, I think everybody has been on this AI hype. So a lot of organizations and HR organizations have not necessarily sat back and said, why do we want to incorporate AI? What's the benefit that we are trying to seek? Is it improvements in productivity? If so, how are we going to measure that? Is it improvements in quality? Is it improvement in output? Is it new capabilities that we want access to? So I think the first step to overcome the barrier is actually to have the conversation around why do we want to utilize AI and what does benefit and success and good look like for us? The second one then is to create focus. We find a lot of organizations are almost taking this approach to say, I know I need to do something with AI. So, I buy everybody licenses to some sort of tool or give them access. And then I hope they will tell me what innovative ways that they've applied it in the organization. And we find that that's not a sustainable way of doing it. So secondly, I would say go and create focus around the use cases on where you want to start, and start with a process that you know really, really well so that you can see the impact and the implications of the AI as you start pushing through. The other component there is you have to build oversight into your AI application. And an oversight committee is not only representatives from the technology side, there has to be representatives on the HR side, risk side, and tech side that can guide how we are going to mature these experiments over time. And then lastly, there has to be a skills focus. How do you give your people the skills to work effectively as well as the confidence to really utilize some of these tool sets? And I think that will help with the barriers, because a lot of it is people don't quite know how to get started. So then there's almost this lack of wanting to try, at that particular level. But for me, focus, and have the rationale and the reason behind why you want to do it.
Now, since you spoke about skills, right? Let's peel the onion a bit and let's get into the mismatch when it comes to skills. Why do you think so few companies are leveraging skills-based hiring practices effectively?
So there we also need to understand that, and the skills-based movement in organizations really came from the fact that people are asking the question, are jobs the right way to organize work in the future? Because we don't necessarily are able to access talent and the talent that we require in that particular way. So we've seen massive applications of that in practices such as talent marketplaces, career management, etc. But the practice that people have been struggling with quite extensively is on the talent acquisition side. And there's a couple of reasons for that, right? The first one, it's a real practical reason around you need a different type of technology to help you drive skills-based hiring at scale. The second type of thing to think about there is it is a very big mindset shift for the organization. If we are hiring for skills, very often a leader or a manager would ask the question, but what if I don't need that skill anymore? What do we do with that talent? So it is this mindset shift that we need to apply around starting to think about work very differently and starting to think about the work that needs to get done, the skills I need to perform the work, and how do we drive skills mobility internally in the organization once we have acquired that particular talent. And I think a good place to learn from is in some of the functions or industries where gig work is not anything new, where they've been utilizing those types of methods in a very successful way. To start there and to then start transcending that a lot more into the way that we think about skills-based hiring and that we start thinking about talent in a different way. But it's a paradigm shift that organizations need to make, and it is quite tough to do that in the hiring side, and it's tough to do that on the reward side. It's easier to do that in things like learning and things like performance, and in the career management piece as well. So I think there's a mindset shift that still needs to happen there.
Awesome. Let's continue on this very topic. What role do internal talent marketplaces play in bridging the skills gap, and are organizations ready to adopt them?
Yeah, I think there's been a massive boom in internal talent marketplaces for a couple of reasons, right? I think people have also been asking the question to say, there's that age-old saying that says the talent that you need is actually already in your organization. You just need to find a way to unearth them and connect them to the opportunities. So I think on the internal talent marketplace perspective, we've seen a lot of progress there around the technology side of things that you need, but also on the other end, really to start connecting the skill sets that you have internally in the organization to other opportunities to really give them exposure and to start really driving that development and that career focus for people over time. So I think it's going to play such an important part of any talent management strategy in the future, because we know as you've just mentioned, there is a skill scarcity out there. There is a skills mismatch. So we have to ask the question, how do we optimize the utilization of the skills we have? It's good for the company, makes sense in terms of the skills pipeline, also great for the individual in terms of stretching them, giving them new opportunities, new exposure. But you need really good data, you need a really good technology platform to guide that, and you need to really drive that change process internally for people to start opening up and also understanding, and this happens in a lot of organizations, talent is not owned by a particular area in the business. Skills are something that we need to optimize and utilize across the organization in a meaningful and in a responsible way. So I'm a very big supporter of talent marketplaces. I think they're going to be key for organizations to unlock the potential that they require to deliver in future.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for that. Let's now talk about a very interesting topic, and this has to do with bringing together diverse workforces, in terms of demographics. My question for you is, how can organizations balance the need for older workers' expertise with the demand for fresh perspectives from younger employees? I think we need both of them, right? Yeah. And it could be very tricky when it comes to sort of balancing this out.
No, spot on. And I mean, to put that into context, we find that we know we've got an aging population in certain parts of the world. And in other parts of the world, you've got a rising youth population that wants to enter into the market. And we find this multi-generational workforce. For the very first time in history, you will have a workforce where you might be working with your father as well as with your children, to kind of put it into that type of context around how broad that's going to be. So there's a couple of things we need to think about. As the workforce changes and people start working longer beyond what we call retirement ages today, because that is also steadily increasing over time, there is going to be this need that we need to understand that segment of the workforce and what their needs are in a very different way, because they are at a different career stage. And we have to really think about what does the late stage career look like for those individuals. And I mention that because I'm a very big supporter of then saying we do need both sides of the spectrum because they bring something different to the workforce. One side might bring very much new, innovative ideas, fresh thinking, new perspectives, but the other side brings experience, they bring exposure, they bring years of institutional knowledge, and organizations need to think about how do we unlock that. And a lot of organizations have very successfully implemented things like reverse mentoring programs, but I think there is a stigma that we first need to overcome in the organization around ageism, which is something that really exists in a lot of organizations where there's these perceptions which are not true at all, where people say, older workers are not great with technology or with digital, or they're not as innovative as younger workers, for example. We really need to change that conversation because workers are different at different stages of the life cycle, and they bring very different experiences and exposure to the table that I think is beneficial also for the younger generations to learn from over time. I think mentoring, coaching, getting those connections to both sides is going to be such an important thing to build a really inclusive workplace, because inclusivity also has to include the different age segments that you will find in your workforce in future.
Great. And again, building on this very perspective from a diversity standpoint, according to you, what's the role of HR in creating inclusive workplaces for older workers? And how does this intersect with the broader DEI goals?
So I think there's a couple of things to think about in terms of different levels almost, right? I think at the very basic level, we need to look at some of our practices and policies, and some of them are exclusionary in nature. To give a practical example there's things that need to change around when we think about succession planning. Very often organizations would say they'll use age as one of the criteria to identify potential successors for the future. Now, my question is that not actually reducing the talent pool that you want? If you start thinking a little bit broader, that yes, people will work longer, but they want to work in a different way. So what new type of work arrangements can we think about, for that part of the workforce? Secondly, I think we have to then also adapt our HR practices. And there's an organization that's using a lovely thing where they actually implement grandparental leave. So when, you get grandchildren, you can also take leave. It's a leave category to also be there at that special moment for you in your family's life. But they've acknowledged that their workforce is now older, and this is actually now something that their workforce has to deal with, in quite an extensive way. At the next level, I think HR plays a role of what do we believe in culture? You get what you celebrate and you get what you tolerate. So what are those things that we put in place in the organizational culture to really be inclusive and allow people from all walks of life to be able to belong? And I think it's more of a culture change that we need to drive, and guiding leaders to be able to get there over time, as well as then a very practical thing of teaching managers, how do I actually manage a multi-generational workforce. What happens if all of a sudden in the same team I have the spectrum of people differing 40 years in age? As a manager, how do I deal with that? As a leader, how do I deal with that? So I think it's really practical things that we need to do, as HR around policies, practices, education for people, and then shaping the culture that will become more inclusive in future.
Very profound, and thanks for sharing such detailed perspective, Dieter. Appreciate that. Let's now talk about one topic which is extremely crucial, but yet we see a lot of gap when it comes to actual ground level execution and outcomes, right? And I'm talking about employee engagement 2.0. Despite decades of investments, right, both effort, time, money, whatever we call it, the global engagement levels remain stagnant. According to you, what's missing from the current engagement strategies at a very broad level? Some broad strokes, please, on this.
I think there's, and we're coming out of this era, and I say this very respectfully, where I think there's been a lot of gimmicky type of strategies for employee engagement. So what I mean by that is, things that don't really influence the employer and employee relationship in a meaningful way. And what we're starting to see employee demands a lot more to say, it's not for me anymore about the fancy office, and it's not about the perks that I get and the benefits that I get, but it is about the core things that matter to me in the relationship. And that is, am I paid fairly? Am I treated with respect? Do I see myself, a future for myself in this organization where I can grow? And then aligned to that, do I work for a manager that I really can trust and that I feel takes me along on this particular journey? And does the leadership of the business inspire me? So I think what we're seeing in Employee Engagement 2.0 is almost to go and focus on the essentials and on the things that really, really matter, as opposed to the surface level things and the perky, gimmicky type of things that very often we put in front of employees as a way to show that we care for employees. Get to the heart of the matter, get to the things that really matter to them. And we're seeing, especially interestingly enough, in the younger generation, that they are actually demanding a lot more of that, as opposed to what companies very often think they want in terms of fun workplaces and those types of elements. So for me, that's the shift in Engagement 2.0, is to get back to what really matters and how do we make sure that there's a solid employer-employee relationship that is sustainable in place.
Great. And you're bang on this one. Thank you so much. Let's now talk about resilience, right? In your opinion, how can organizations create environments where employees feel safe to experiment and learn from failures? I think there's also a concept called as zero consequence learning or zero consequence listening, right? And I feel we've got to a point where if I were to talk about anti-fragile as a concept, there has to be a fine balance that one has to strike between being vulnerable, right, and being protective enough of how much stress one can take on, right? So from that standpoint, I think it's important that one has to go through certain bit of grinding, if you will, to be able to become better at their craft, right? So your take on this, please. How should organizations create such environments?
So I think to focus on the part around how do organizations create safe spaces for people to be innovative and to try new things. I think what's really important there, and I sometimes smile at organizations because I ask them, is innovation important to you? And they'll say, yes, absolutely. And then I say, okay, great. How do you deal with failure? How do you deal it when people make a mistake? Then they say, no, quality, super important for us. If somebody makes a mistake, we are really tough on performance. And those two things contradict each other. So you have to ask the question, what type of behaviors are we celebrating and tolerating in our environment? And how do we teach people also to experiment responsibly? Because it's not just opening up and allowing everybody to do what they want to from an innovation point of view, but teaching them the skills to be able to do that. And then a very important point that you've made is, how do we deal with failure as part of learning forward? Because failure is just an opportunity for us to reflect, to make sense of, and to learn, but that's a way that we can't do it. What else can we try as part of that? And that's a very different way and a perspective to bring into the organization. Touch on your last point there, and that really then calls for us to start thinking about, we live in a very complex world that's changing a lot at the moment. So people need to learn from a resilience point of view, how do I deal with setbacks? How do I deal with failure? How do I get back up as part of that? But also, how do I learn through the difficulties? Because very often when we think about resilience, we just think it's about being knocked down and standing up again. it's not just about that. It's also about what do I learn during that type of process, that on the other side, I have new muscles that I've strengthened to be able to deal with the ambiguity and the adversity there as well. So maybe to summarize that, I think organizations need to understand what types of behaviors they are encouraging in the business. I think they need to create an environment where people can experiment responsibly. I think they have to help people understand, how do I learn through failure, and how do I strengthen myself and build that resilience to try again. I think that's going to be such an important part of well-being and of culture into the future.
Very well articulated, Dieter. Thank you for that. Let's now talk about HR in entirety, right? What their role is all about. So why do you think execution is often overlooked when people discuss HR strategy, right? There's a lot of boardroom talk that happens. There's a lot of plans, that get built. But like I said, when it comes to execution, maybe the focus is not that much. So what's the core reason? What do you think organizations can do to execute as well, or if not better than how well they plan?
So I think the starting point there is, ever since the 1990s, we've had this narrative in HR around, wanting to become more strategic. We've got the BP partnering model that is really aimed and focused on bringing us closer to business value and to shareholder and stakeholder value. Now, I think that's definitely the right direction. A lot of organizations have done well in that regard. However, one of the unintended consequences was there's this narrative that strategic HR work is better or more valuable than operational, administrative, execution-focused HR work. And that's absolute nonsense. I think we have to understand and realize that HR operates at 3 different levels. Strategically, how do we align with the organization? Tactically, how do we translate that into our practices and our policies? And how's that built upon a very solid bedrock of administrative and operational excellence? And those 3 levels need to work collectively together for HR really to create meaningful impact. The work isn't more or less important. The work is just very different as part of that. And I think when we start thinking about it in that way, we will then start thinking very differently about how we invest in HR, how we resource at the different levels, and then really just how do we drive collective impact? Because very often there's this uncalled for tension within HR around kind of who's more important because I deal with the business versus you sitting in a shared service center. We need to eradicate that and really help people understand that value looks different at the 3 levels, but compounded value together is what we need to get out to. And I think that changes the way that we then think about our investment in execution. Because without great execution, HR just talks about a lot of promises that don't materialize. And I think we have to balance that if we really want to have an impact on things like employee experience and business sustainability in the long term.
Awesome. Totally agree with you. Let's now talk about upskilling or reskilling HR, right? I think that they are so much in the business of upskilling and reskilling people. Many a times, they're not able to, play a vital role in assessing, how they want to upskill themselves. So, what are the most important skills HR professionals will need to stay relevant in 2025 and beyond? Your thoughts on that, please.
So we talk about the T-shaped HR professional of the future, and that's just a way to organize the skills and the competencies that HR will require. There's 5 core ones that we think is important for all HR professionals, regardless of your level. Business acumen, you need to understand the business, and we've been talking about this for years, but it's even more important now than ever before, around being able to connect what you do to business impact and understanding what's happening in the market. The second one is data literacy. Doesn't mean that all HR professionals need to be data scientists, but it does mean that we have to become a lot more evidence-based in the use of data to really drive business decision-making. Third one is digital agility. How do you execute through technology? Well, how do you apply a digital mindset? A lot of the things that we spoke about today is also very much tied to that. People advocacy, how do we build cultures of well-being and productivity? It's such an important thing as HR professionals to really be skilled in that. And then lastly, execution excellence, which is a lot more on the interpersonal side, being action-oriented. How do we create influence? How do we manage stakeholders? How do we problem solve within the organization? That's then complemented what we call then the stem of the T, which is then obviously your specialist technical expertise. That will remain important. For me, what is important for HR professionals is to understand, if I'm a recruiter, where do I fit in the bigger HR value chain, and how do I actually add value in other parts of the HR value chain as well, as opposed to just my own technical area. And then lastly, leadership. We sometimes forget that HR are leaders in their own right as well. And we really need to enable HR as people leaders of HR functions, but also then as the leaders of the people agenda in a lot of organizations, because that is going to call for a different type of skill set. So those 5 core ones, supplemented depending on role and context and organization by the other 2.
Great. Thank you. Just to summarize this for our listeners, business acumen, right? Make sure that whatever you're trying to do has an impact on the overall organization's trajectory. Second, as much as possible, try to be evidence-based, which means that one has to be data literate. Third is make sure that you have a tech mindset, digital first approach, so that you can drive things at a fast pace. Then one has to make sure that they take care of people advocacy. And lastly, are more to do with interpersonal, making sure you have awesome leadership skills. And the last one is to make sure that everything is action-based, execution excellence. So, okay, awesome. I think you covered it all. Thank you so much for that, Dieter. This brings me to the last question of this awesome conversation. If there's one current HR trend you think will look back on as a mistake, what would it be?
So, whenever we talk about trends, we talk about trends in terms of trying to understand how they're going to influence the decisions we make. So I'm almost going to think about that. I think there's 2 trends that we have been talking about where I think as HR professionals, there's some missed opportunities that we should have grasped that we didn't. A couple of years ago, we were talking much more about product-based HR solutions. So almost for HR to think about what we deliver, not as a service, but as a product, and to build it in that particular way. I think there's been a bit of a missed opportunity because that trend seems to have become quite quiet in recent times. And then this one you're going to smile about, but there was a lot of hype about metaverse and what that means for employee engagement and for employee relations. And then that technology kind of almost just died out in terms of its practical application. There's still bits and pieces of that happening around that. So what I think in terms of not necessarily trends that would be mistakes, I would rather say trends that didn't play out the way that we expected to, and maybe there's some missed opportunity, on the horizon. But specifically for those, us becoming more product based, and how would we utilize, some technologies, metaverse related, etc. Doesn't mean that we have to go there, but I think it would be interesting to understand why we chose not to, and did it just happen, or was it a conscious decision for us in the community?
Thank you so very much. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners would also learn a lot from what you had to share today. But that's not where it ends, right? AIHR has, which is Academy to Innovate HR, has published an HR Trends Report 2025, which all the listeners would be able to find in the show notes, which we will share. We'll continue to bring you fantastic perspectives from across the globe on the CHRO Mindset podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review if you enjoyed the episode. See you again in the next episode. Thanks again.